Hello everybody, my name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm an author, robot, and today we're going to do a genre breakdown. You know, you're a sci-fi, you're a fantasy, you're a mystery, it looks like, with your cloak and your top hat and your opium. Anyway, we're doing genre classifications today, kind of just the big ones, because there are a lot of genres if you really want to break it down. So we're going to look into the really big ones, what it means to be in them, sort of. Not necessarily the conventions, because each genre with its conventions is a whole video on their own. And whether you need to know what genre you are when you start writing, or at what point you should know your genre. So bear with me, let's get into this pretty big topic here. And before we get started, I just wanted to remind everybody of the completely originally named, not at all plagiarized at all from somebody named UDPie, the original Lemoy. The submissions are open for November, and if you're not sure what that is, it is last month I gave you a prompt to submit a story, any genre, nonfiction, fiction, an excerpt, a full flash fiction, up to 750 words, your choice. All you got to do is use the prompt and submit. So I did a bit, and then in the next month, I will read your guys' stories and bask in your greatness. Last month, I submitted to you guys a prompt, and this month you delivered. I read it the 1st of October. It was a great way to start off the month, and I'm looking forward to doing it next month. So if you're interested in joining the Paddy Wagon, the link is in the comments down below with November's prompt. Looking forward to reading you. Now, on to the topic. Genres can sometimes feel like you're putting yourself in a box that doesn't really fit or constrains the creative abilities. Many of us don't like to be constrained, and then when you put us on a specific genre, it feels like we're being forced to write something or forced to fit in some kind of box. Now, some authors can really do well when they have these constraints as their creative kind of fences, so they don't wander off too far, they have their guidelines, but some of us do better by getting away from the conventions and the genres, classifications, and then applying those later. There's no correct way to write a first draft except to get one done. Seriously. Logistics don't matter at round one. So, and there are a lot of authors that actually find out what genre they're writing after they finish their first draft, or after their second draft, or after their third draft, or even when they've edited it like 5 million times, they finally discover, oh, that is the genre that this fits. And it can be from changing just one minor thing on it. So, the first major grouping, and I'm going to start at a major grouping, is known as the commercial fiction group. Commercial fiction are the easily recognizable and mass-produced genres, like romance, horror, mystery, thriller, sci-fi, fantasy, comedy. You get the drift. It's the easily recognizable stuff that is made for mass appeal. Now, don't get me wrong, the previously mentioned genres can also get very deep, but this is just an umbrella term for these very common and very formulaic genres. Commercial fiction generally places an emphasis on a clear and distinct plot, while the other aspects like characterization, exploration of themes, and delicate or extravagant writing might not be handled quite as experimentally or as deeply, however you want to say that. General commercial fiction is just a quick, easy read, and often it fills the shelves of used bookstores as they are kind of one-time reads. That's no shade on mass-produced commercial fiction. People buy it like crazy, and that's why there's just so much of it. Commercial fiction as a huge genre umbrella aims to reach a wide readership base, maximizing its appeal. These books are easily marketable because they're written specifically with readers in mind who love the genre and want to see more of it. This is the guest for now, because he's being noisy. If someone is an avid reader of romance, then they're looking for the specific conventions in romance, and then the books that are marketed as romance have to hit those conventions in order to appeal to that specific market. If you don't hit like the happily ever after, or the conventions or tropes of a romance, then you're not going to appeal to the romance audiences. Commercial fiction also features a more conventional storytelling style. That is, the flow of the events is pretty typical and the storyline can be predictable. Commercial fiction also has a focus on readers' entertainment as opposed to exploring themes, deep ideas, questioning the reader, presenting new ideas, or speaking truth to power, or whatever else you could cram between cover to cover. Commercial fiction isn't meant to be challenging, and that's not to say that there can't be heavy emotions or deep inspiration in it. J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series is considered commercial fiction, but it's also very deep and grew with people in a way that meant a lot to the readers. But we can all at least admit that it is not a philosophical, deep book with difficult writing. It is a quick, easy read. Commercial fiction is also more plot-driven than character-driven, as I kind of just sort of said. And that's not to say that the characters don't change or go through their own journeys, but the story moves because of the plot. An exterior source pushes them forward to do something as opposed to a character movement or growth changing the story, like in 2019's Joker movie. And I know I use that movie as a lot of examples, but that's because it's easy. It's an easy reach, okay? Still, you'll find interesting characters in plot-driven stories and characters with struggles. The depth or exploration within them and their choices just may not be as deep or as layered in character-driven stories. With commercial fiction, the ending is pretty clear. The main character is going to either win or lose, and there really isn't that much ambiguity in most commercial fiction. General fiction also generally has more common, plain, or regular language, closer to what's more casual as opposed to complicated descriptions, purple prose, or language used in poetry or literary fiction. Because of all of the above reasons, commercial fiction is easy to market and sell. It's escapism at its best, because commercial is really just an umbrella for these recognizable genres that are all very popular. With that said, there are a ton of commercial fiction, and we're only going to mention the big five in this video, because otherwise we'd be here for a while. Romance, thriller, mystery, fantasy, and sci-fi. For a romance novel, the main action or plot will revolve around will they or won't they be together in the end. This doesn't mean that it's the only thing going on, but it is part of the main plot and action, and it's going to be the main drive of the characters. That is kind of why when I was reading When No One Is Watching, I said it read like a romance, because the biggest part moving the plot was these two characters interacting and will they or won't they be together. It also had the tropes of starts out as enemies and then grows into lovers, and it was just... It had the markups of a romance, and it was written by a romance author, and so that's kind of where it landed. Paranormal, contemporary, historical, Western, Gothic, Regency, and romantic suspense are also kinds of subgenres for the romance genre. Sci-fi or science fiction deals with technology and or space, and that may or may not possibly be based in science. Some science fiction may focus more on the drama of living in a different kind of universe, like Firefly or Star Trek. Both of those are what would be considered a space opera, kind of like a soap opera, but in space. And then you've got stuff like time travel, parallel universe, Ghostbusters would fall into sci-fi because of the use of technology. You've got dystopians, alt history, cyberpunk, steampunk, military sci-fi, romantic sci-fi, hard and soft sci-fi that are defined by just how much heavy use they have on actual science in the plot. And these are just some of the many subgenres for sci-fi. Fantasy is a very close relative of sci-fi, or I should say it's the other way around since fantasy is the older genre. They require the same source of rules for world building and consistency between the powers that are inside of that world. Fantasy has fantastical elements in creatures or monsters, magic, gods, mythologies. There's urban, contemporary, or traditional fantasy. Horror falls into fantasy. Historical fantasy, weird fiction or bizarro falls into fantasy. Comic fantasy, slipstream, and high or epic fantasy like Lord of the Rings are some of the most common subgenres here. Now, let's do the hard part. What's a mystery versus what's a thriller versus what's a suspense? They all kind of sound the same, and somebody dies in all of them, right? The easiest way to understand the difference between the three is this. Mysteries are about solving a puzzle. Thrillers, the protagonist is in danger from the outset, and suspense is about the tension and what happens with it, or may happen with it. It's less about its own it's less of its own genre and more of something that can be tied into other genres. Like you can have a suspense romance, a suspense sci-fi, you know? So to break these genres down just a little bit more, in a mystery, the main character is occupied by tracking down the truth about an event, usually, but not always a murder. if the protagonist is in danger, it usually isn't really severe, and it's not present until the protagonist gets a lot closer to the truth, and then they start getting in danger. I remember this from when I played Nancy Drew forever ago, and there was really no time-sensitive or you're gonna die situations until you got further in the games, and then you got closer to the truth, and then the killer tried to kill you. A best-selling author, David Morrell, described mystery as, quote, "One crucial distinction is that traditional mysteries appeal primarily to the mind and emphasize the logical solutions to the puzzle." So again, it's about solving a puzzle. Some major subgenres for mystery include noir or hard-boiled, police procedural, which is very by the book and has more procedural information, hence the police procedural. You have to be more specific with that kind of stuff. Cozy and hobby, general mystery, historical, and paranormal, but there are more beyond that. These are just the big ones. When it comes to thriller, there's a push and pull between the protagonist and the antagonist the whole way. The reader is usually asking how and is propelled through the story by action. Unlike in mystery, with thrillers, both the reader and the protagonist usually already know who's responsible for the crime, but both are waiting to see how the criminal is brought to justice. The best-selling author, David Morrell, says about thrillers, "They strive for heightened emotions and emphasize the sensations of what might be called an obstacle race and a scavenger hunt." Some major subgenres of thriller include environmental, supernatural, historical, medical, psychological, legal, military, techno, political, and espionage. Lastly, in suspense stories, the main character may become gradually aware of danger. In a mystery story, the reader is exposed to the same information as the detective, but in a suspense story, the reader is aware of things that are unknown to the protagonist. So in a mystery story, we might be solving the murder along with the main character, whereas in a suspense story, the reader is going to know that a bomb was planted and is going to be like, okay, when is that bomb going to go off, or is the detective going to get there in time? The best-selling crime author Libby Fisher-Hellman said, "Suspense is not so much what is happening as what may happen. It's about anticipation, often anticipating the worst. It is about creating an uncertain situation in which the outcome is in doubt. It's asking a question not immediately answered, raising a concern not immediately addressed, and posting a threat not immediately resolved. Suspense depends on stretching time, delaying answers as long as possible." So that is suspense, mystery, and thriller all wrapped up for you. Now, just because it gets a bad rep, I want to do some definitions for horror here. I've been to enough writing conferences where agents have said the phrase horror has been out of style since the 70s because of slasher flicks ruining the image. Even Stephen King doesn't call his work horror, he calls it supernatural thriller. So, there's still this tight, specific idea of what a horror is, despite there being numerous subgenres for horror. A lot of the time it ends up with it needs to be super monstery, or it needs to be super slashery, or it needs to be like Saw, but that's not all there is. So here are some of the major subgenres for horror to consider if your novel might fall into a horror genre. There's gothic horror, which focuses on death specifically. Paranormal horror, which covers ghost stories and supernatural horror that might exist outside scientific explanation. The occult horror deals with religion, rituals, demons, that sort of stuff. Dark fantasy are stories that blend elements of fantasy with darkness, like death or murder or what have you. Survival horror are stories where the main character is being hunted and trying to survive within their circumstances, like my debut novel Dead End Drive, which you can get right now, link in the description. And then there is science fiction horror, which blends elements of, you guessed it, sci-fi with dark elements like murder or death or what all you can think of for dark elements. And these aren't all of the genres or subgenres, but these are the biggest that I could find in commercial fiction. And really, the biggest 5 in commercial fiction are, again, mystery, thriller, romance, sci-fi, and fantasy. Now, for an aside, I call myself an author of speculative fiction. And, you know, before I started doing that, I wondered what that phrase, spec fiction, even meant, and it's been helpful for me to know. So let's jump into that really quick. Speculative fiction is an umbrella term used for fiction that does not necessarily belong fully in science fiction or fully in the fantasy genre. It's a broad genre umbrella for anything that has fantastical elements in it, but may also include other elements such as literary or upmarket writing, and doesn't just kind of fit cozily into genre expectations. Spec fic can also include sci-fi, fantasy, apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic is one of those nights. Dystopian, utopian, urban fantasy, space opera, horror, magical realism, ghost stories, and superhero stories, and the like. But not all of these will necessarily be spec fic by default. The Oxford Research Encyclopedia's article on speculative fiction actually says the term was coined in 1941 by author Robert A. Heinlein. He described speculative fiction as, quote, narratives concerned not so much with science or technology as with human action in response to the new situations created by science or technology. Speculative fiction highlights the human rather than the technological problem. So, really, it's anything that might have some fantastical elements in it that might not fit into the ease of the commercial genre fiction classification and does not necessarily focus on the fantasy or the magic aspect, but the human aspect that's in this fantastical world. The last major genre, I know, are we tired yet? The last major genre that I'm going to talk about today is literary fiction, and the line between literary fiction and commercial fiction can actually sometimes be pretty subtle, but it does exist. Where commercial fiction aims to entertain, literary fiction aims to give a true picture of the human condition or present some larger thematic idea. Most commonly, literary fiction doesn't necessarily fit into one neat genre. The style, imagery, or language may be explored more, and then there are no rules or boundaries within this genre that must be fulfilled in order to be literary, in the same way that you have to if you're writing romance. There has to be a happily ever after. The storytelling style may be innovative or new or bizarre, and sometimes I hate this and it looks like garbage in my opinion, like, Visit from the Goon Squad. It was too much for me. Literary also focuses more on character development and changes as opposed to the plot, but that doesn't mean that literary fiction doesn't have a plot, though I've noticed some that really just don't. You get more exploration into how actions of the character take effects on them. Literary fiction is an exploration of the human condition, and it will showcase human behaviors. The language may be more complex, and the endings may be unclear, which is different than in genre fiction, where the endings are usually clear, either you win or you lose. With all that said, do you need to know what you're writing when you start your writing? No, you don't. And I said this at the top of the video, and I'll say it again, you don't need to know what genre you're writing when you start writing your work. Unless you're preparing for your query, you really don't need to know. At the end of the day, the genre is really just a marketing tool. It lets people know what they're getting into, set their expectations, and help them find what it is that they're looking for. It lets them know, sort of in general senses, what's inside of the cover of your book and if that would interest them. It's important to know if a book is a sci-fi if somebody is really not interested in a sci-fi. It's important to know if something is mainly a romance if somebody's not interested in a romance. Or, the versus of that is, I need to know it's a romance if I'm interested in a romance. Imagine the last time that you started a movie thinking that it was one thing and it turned out to be another and you were super disappointed. That is what genres do. But the genre is entirely for marketing, and the author doesn't really need to worry about it unless they're crafting that initial story specifically inside of the genre perimeters. Literary agent Nathan Bansford said, quote, I've seen novels that were called one thing at the query stage, something else at the submission stage, and still something else at the publication stage. For your query, just shoot for the bookstore section that it would be in and call it a day. So, if you've let your genre hold you back from writing your first work or writing the first draft or getting in the way of any work at all, don't worry about it. Push them genre queries aside and get your words out. You'll figure out what to call it later when you come up with the title that you like as well. But those are my thoughts. I'm just a robot. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and if you feel so inclined, let me know what you're working on. Let me know all your thoughts on this and more in the comments down below. If you have any suggestions for things you'd like me to cover, also let me know. If you enjoyed this sort of video, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, talk to you later, have a good weekend, and don't die. Dear Madam Astra, that's me. We regret to inform you that on August 1st, your employer, Agatha Jane Benedict, owner of the Benedict estate, peacefully passed away in her sleep. Oh, that's so sad. Wait. Let me try that again. Oh my goodness. That's so sad. Yeah, I think I'm ready. With millions of dollars on the line and the opportunity for your every need to be taken care of for life. Tell me, is there anything more valuable than that? I didn't think so. Dead End Drive is a dark comedy novel that makes 3 promises. 1, an illustrious estate in Louisiana. 2, an opulent dinner affair for all in attendance. And 3, and most importantly of all, lots and lots of competitive murder. So if you're looking for a cozy book to settle in with for the spooky season, I've only got one question for you. Will I see you at the whale reading?